The autumn wind carried the scent of coal smoke and dust, as Abigail Zimmerman clutched her handkerchief tightly, watching the train disappear into the horizon, its black smoke trailing behind like broken promises. The Sierra Nevada mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow despite it being only September of 1876. Abigail stood alone on the wooden platform of the San Andreas depot in Calaveras County, California, her single trunk beside her the only possession she had left in the world. "He said he would be here," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the fading whistle of the departed train. The station master had already retreated into his office, giving her a sympathetic yet uncomfortable glance before closing his door. San Andreas was a modest mining town, not nearly as wild as some California settlements, but still no place for a young woman to be stranded alone as afternoon shadows lengthened. Abigail smoothed her travel-worn navy blue dress, fighting back tears that threatened to spill onto her cheeks. Her cousin Thomas had assured her he would meet her train, offering her a fresh start after the fever had taken her parents in Philadelphia. The journey west had consumed nearly all her savings, and now she stood abandoned, with nowhere to go in a strange town where she knew not a soul. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the platform emptied of the few other passengers who had been met by family or business associates. Only Abigail remained, her honey-blonde hair coming loose from its pins in the persistent wind, her 22 years of life suddenly feeling woefully inadequate preparation for her current predicament. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the wooden platform. Abigail took a deep breath and attempted to lift her trunk, but its weight was too much for her slender frame. She had packed everything she thought she would need for her new life: her mother's silver hairbrush, her father's pocket watch, a few treasured books, and all the clothing she could fit. Now the trunk seemed like an anchor, tethering her to this desolate spot. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the dusty road leading to the station. A rider approached, his silhouette growing more distinct against the setting sun. Abigail straightened her posture, raising a hand to shield her eyes from the glare as she tried to determine if this might be her tardy cousin. The man who rode up was not Thomas. He sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders squared beneath a worn leather vest. His face was partially obscured by the shadow cast by his wide-brimmed hat, but she could see he was young, perhaps in his late 20s, with several days' growth of beard darkening his jaw. A six-shooter was holstered at his hip, and his clothes bore the dust of the trail. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat as he dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the wooden planks of the platform. "Seems you've been left stranded." His voice was deep, with a gentle drawl that suggested he hailed from somewhere in the southern states. His eyes, blue as a clear summer sky, assessed her situation in one sweeping glance. "My cousin was to meet me," Abigail explained, her voice stronger than she felt. "I fear something may have delayed him." The cowboy nodded slowly, leading his chestnut gelding closer. "Name's Jackson Irwin," he said. "Most folks call me Jack. I know most everyone in these parts. Your cousin's name?" "Thomas Zimmerman," she replied. "I'm Abigail Zimmerman." A shadow crossed Jackson's face, and Abigail felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Miss Zimmerman," he said carefully, removing his hat and holding it against his chest. "I'm afraid I've got some news that ain't easy to hear. Thomas Zimmerman was caught in a mine collapse 3 days ago at the North Star mine." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. "Is he?" "He's alive," Jackson assured her quickly. "But he's laid up at Doc Miller's place with a broken leg and some nasty cuts. He's been in and out of consciousness with fever." He paused. "I reckon that's why there was no one to meet your train." Abigail swayed slightly, and Jackson stepped forward quickly, his strong hand catching her elbow to steady her. "I have nowhere to go," she whispered, the reality of her situation crashing down upon her. No family, no accommodations, and precious little money left in her reticule. Jackson Irwin studied her face for a long moment. His eyes, though weathered by sun and wind, held a kindness that gave Abigail a flicker of hope. "Miss Zimmerman," he said softly, leaning closer so that only she could hear his words, "stay with me. I've got a small ranch just outside of town. It ain't much, but there's a spare room where you'd be safe until your cousin recovers." Under any other circumstances, Abigail would have rejected such an offer immediately. A proper lady did not accept invitations to the homes of strange men. But as the last light faded from the sky and the chill of the mountain evening settled around her shoulders, propriety seemed a luxury she could not afford. "I couldn't impose," she said weakly, though her options were non-existent. "It's no imposition," Jackson replied. "I was heading to town anyway when I saw the train pull out. Thomas is a good man. He helped me once when my horse came up lame near his claim. I'd be doing him a service by looking after his kin." He gazed at the darkening sky. "Night's coming on fast, and the boarding house in town will be full up with miners. Not the sort of place for a lady anyway." He gestured to her trunk. "I can strap that to my saddle, and you can ride Copper here back to my place." Abigail hesitated, years of cautionary warnings from her mother echoing in her mind. Yet there was something in Jackson Irwin's steady gaze that inspired trust. "I'll take you to see your cousin tomorrow," he added. "But right now, you need a safe place to rest." With the station master already gone home and the town unfamiliar, Abigail made her decision. "Thank you, Mr. Irwin. I accept your kind offer." Jackson nodded, lifting her heavy trunk with ease and securing it to his saddle with leather straps. Then he helped Abigail mount his horse, her skirts arranged as modestly as possible across the saddle. "I'll walk alongside," he said, taking the reins and leading the horse down the dirt road that led away from the San Andreas depot. As they moved away from the station, Abigail cast one last glance back at the empty platform where her hopes had briefly died. The cowboy's whispered words, "Stay with me," played again in her mind. They seemed both a lifeline and a dangerous proposition. But as the lights of San Andreas fell behind them, and the stars emerged in the vast California sky, Abigail Zimmerman decided that fate had delivered her into these hands for a reason. Jackson Irwin's ranch was modest but neat, situated in a small valley about 2 miles outside of San Andreas. A one-story cabin constructed of sturdy logs stood near a creek that babbled softly in the darkness. A small barn and corral completed the homestead, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "It ain't much," Jackson said as he helped Abigail down from the horse, his strong hands encircling her waist briefly before setting her gently on the ground. "But it's home." He led Copper to the hitching post near the cabin's porch and tied the reins securely before unstrapping Abigail's trunk. "Let me get this inside and then see to my horse," he said, lifting the trunk onto his shoulder with remarkable ease. Abigail followed him up the 2 wooden steps to the porch, noting the sturdy construction and the cleanliness of the surroundings. Though simple, the cabin showed signs of care, a rocking chair positioned to catch the afternoon sun. Pots of native wildflowers lined along the edge of the porch, their blooms closed for the night. Jackson pushed open the door and carried her trunk inside, setting it down near a stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the main room. He quickly lit a lamp on the table, illuminating a space that was surprisingly tidy for a bachelor's residence. "The spare room's through there," he said, pointing to a door on the right. "It ain't fancy, but the bedding's clean. I'll get a fire going to take the chill off while you get settled." Abigail stepped further into the cabin, taking in the simple furnishings: a solid wooden table with 4 chairs, a cabinet holding dishes and supplies, a bookshelf with a surprising number of volumes, and a comfortable-looking armchair near the fireplace. A rifle hung above the mantel, and various tools of ranch life were organized neatly along the walls. "You live here alone, Mr. Irwin?" she asked, realizing too late how forward the question might sound. Jackson didn't seem to take offense. "Just me and Copper," he replied, kneeling to arrange kindling in the fireplace. "And the cattle, of course. Got a small herd, nothing compared to the big spreads, but enough to make a living." He struck a match, and the kindling caught quickly. "Had a ranch hand, Miguel, but he headed back to his family in Mexico last month. Been managing on my own since." He stood, brushing his hands on his jeans. "I'll see to Copper and bring in some more firewood. Make yourself comfortable, Miss Zimmerman." When the door closed behind him, Abigail took a moment to gather herself. The events of the day had left her reeling, from the excitement of arriving in California to the despair of being abandoned at the station, and now finding herself in the home of a stranger. A handsome stranger, she acknowledged to herself, though she quickly pushed the thought aside. She moved to explore the spare room he had indicated. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a colorful quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a small chest of drawers. A window looked out toward the creek, though in the darkness she could see little beyond her own reflection. By the time Jackson returned with an armful of firewood, Abigail had removed her hat and gloves and was standing by the fireplace, warming her hands. "I've got some stew left from dinner," he said, stacking the wood neatly in a box beside the hearth. "Nothing fancy, but it's filling. You must be hungry after your journey." "That's very kind, thank you," Abigail replied, suddenly aware of her empty stomach. The last meal she'd eaten had been a hurried breakfast on the train many hours ago. Jackson moved with efficiency around the small kitchen area, stoking the cook stove and setting a pot of stew to warm. He poured water from a bucket into a kettle and placed it on the stove as well. "Thought you might like some tea," he explained. "Got it from the general store in town. Don't drink it myself much, but I keep some for visitors." "You have many visitors out here?" Abigail asked, taking a seat at the table at his gesture. A small smile crossed his face, softening the weathered lines around his eyes. "Not so many," he admitted. "Occasionally a neighbor stopping by, or the circuit preacher when he's in these parts." As the stew heated, Jackson set the table with simple but clean dishes and poured the hot water into a teapot. "Tell me about Philadelphia," he said as he served the stew, a hearty mixture of beef, potatoes, and carrots. "Never been east of the Mississippi myself." Grateful for the easy conversation topic, Abigail described her life in the city, her father's position as a bookkeeper for a shipping company, her mother's involvement with the church, the modest but comfortable home they had shared until the fever had swept through their neighborhood, taking both her parents within days of each other. "I'm sorry for your loss," Jackson said simply when she finished, his eyes reflecting genuine sympathy. "Thank you," Abigail replied, finding comfort in his straightforward compassion. "It's been 6 months now. When Cousin Thomas wrote offering me a place to stay and a position teaching at the school here, it seemed like Providence." Jackson nodded, refilling her teacup. "San Andreas is growing. The mines bring in men, and many bring families now that things have settled down from the early gold rush days. They're in need of educated folk." "And you, Mr. Irwin, how long have you been in California?" Abigail asked, feeling more at ease as her hunger was satisfied and warmth from the fire reached the farthest corners of the cabin. "Call me Jack," he said. "Everyone does." He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Came out in '67, right after the war. Was too young to fight, but old enough to see what it did to my hometown in Georgia. Wanted a fresh start where a man's worth wasn't measured by which side his family chose." "You were just a boy," Abigail said, calculating that he must have been only 16 or 17 when he journeyed west. "Old enough to work," Jack replied with a slight shrug. "Drove cattle, broke horses, worked claims. Saved every penny until I could put a down payment on this land 3 years ago." His eyes swept the cabin with quiet pride. "It ain't much compared to what you're used to in Philadelphia, but every board and nail is mine." There was something in his tone, not defiance, but a simple statement of a hard-won truth that struck Abigail. Despite her exhaustion, she found herself curious about this man who had taken in a stranded stranger with such easy generosity. After the meal, Jack insisted she take the rocking chair near the fire while he cleaned up. "You've had a long journey," he said when she protested. "Rest a spell. Tomorrow we'll go into town and see your cousin." As the evening deepened, Abigail felt her eyelids growing heavy, lulled by the warmth of the fire and the gentle rhythm of the rocking chair. She must have dozed, for she woke with a start to find Jack draping a soft blanket over her. "I've brought your trunk into your room," he said quietly. "There's water in the pitcher if you want to wash up before bed." "Thank you," Abigail murmured, embarrassed to have fallen asleep in his presence. "You've been so kind to a stranger." Jack smiled slightly. "We're all strangers until we get to know each other, Miss Zimmerman." "Abigail," she offered, "if I'm to call you Jack." "Abigail," he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. "Sleep well. Dawn comes early in these parts." In the small bedroom, Abigail quickly prepared for bed, washing her face and hands in the cool water before changing into her nightgown. As she slipped beneath the quilt, she realized this was the first night in months that she hadn't cried herself to sleep thinking of her parents and the home she had lost. Perhaps, she thought as sleep claimed her, California might offer a new beginning after all. Morning came with golden light streaming through the small window and the distant lowing of cattle. For a moment, Abigail was disoriented, the unfamiliar room confusing her sleep-addled mind. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back: the empty train platform, the cowboy's arrival, his whispered offer. She dressed quickly in a simple blue cotton dress, pinned her hair into a neat bun, and steeled herself to face her host. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Jack already up, stoking the cook stove and setting a skillet to heat. "Good morning," he greeted her, turning at the sound of her footsteps. "Sleep well?" "Very well, thank you," Abigail replied, noticing how the morning light emphasized the strong lines of his profile. Without his hat, his dark hair showed a hint of curl, and freshly shaven, he looked younger than he had the previous evening. "Thought we'd have breakfast, then ride into town to see Thomas," Jack said, cracking eggs into the skillet. "Dr. Miller's place is on the edge of San Andreas near the church." Breakfast was a simple but satisfying affair of eggs, bacon, and biscuits that Jack had somehow managed to bake while she slept. They ate in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional question about what to expect in town. "San Andreas is the county seat now," Jack explained as they cleared the dishes. "Got a proper courthouse, a few stores, couple of saloons. The mines keep the town lively, but it's settled down from the early days. Ladies can walk the main street without worry, especially in daylight." After breakfast, Jack saddled 2 horses Copper for himself and a gentle mare named Daisy for Abigail. "Can you ride?" he asked as he adjusted the stirrups on the side saddle. Yes, Abigail assured him. My father believed all proper young ladies should know how. She didn't add that it had been years since she'd been on horseback, her life in the city offering few opportunities for riding. Jack helped her mount, his hands strong and sure as he guided her foot to the stirrup. Once she was settled, he swung up onto Copper with practiced ease, and they set off toward town. The morning was glorious, the California sunshine warming the air as they rode. The landscape was different from anything Abigail had known in the east rolling hills covered in golden grass, dotted with massive oak trees that spread their branches wide. In the distance, the Sierra Nevada mountains rose in majestic peaks, still bearing the last of the previous winter's snow on their highest points. It's beautiful, she said, taking in the panorama. Jack glanced at her, a smile touching his lips. Different from Philadelphia, I expect. Very, she agreed. Everything seems bigger somehow. The sky, the mountains, even the trees. That's California for you, Jack said. Makes a man feel small sometimes, but in a good way. Reminds you that there's more to life than your own troubles. They rode in silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a hawk, overhead the only interruption to their thoughts. San Andreas came into view as they crested a small rise, a collection of wooden buildings strung along a main street, with smaller houses and structures spreading out from the center. A white church steeple rose near one end of town, and the red brick courthouse dominated the central square. Not as grand as Philadelphia, Jack said, but it serves us well enough. They rode past the general store, the assayer's office, and a hotel whose sign proclaimed it the San Andreas Grand. Men in mining clothes mingled with more formally dressed townspeople on the wooden sidewalks. A few women in calico dresses carried baskets of shopping or shepherded children along the street. Jack led them to a white painted house set back from the main road, a small sign near the gate identifying it as Dr. J. Miller, physician. He dismounted and helped Abigail from her saddle, then tied both horses to the hitching post. Dr. Miller's a good man, Jack said as they approached the front door. Came out from Boston during the gold rush and stayed on to tend the sick and injured. Seen him pull men through worse than what your cousin's got. A middle-aged woman in a crisp apron answered Jack's knock, her stern expression softening when she recognized him. Morning, Mrs. Hollies, Jack said, removing his hat. This is Miss Abigail Zimmerman, Thomas Zimmerman's cousin. She's come to see him. The doctor said to expect you, Mrs. Hollies replied, opening the door wider. Mr. Zimmerman's been asking for someone named Abigail since he woke properly yesterday afternoon. Come in, come in. She led them through a tidy parlor that served as a waiting room and down a hallway to a room at the back of the house. The smell of carbolic acid and medicinal herbs hung in the air. He's still weak, Mrs. Hollies warned as she opened the door. Dr. Miller says no excitement. Thomas Zimmerman lay on a narrow bed, his right leg elevated and encased in a plaster cast. His face was pale beneath his brown beard, and a bandage wrapped around his head partially covered his auburn hair. At 35, he looked older than Abigail remembered from his last visit to Philadelphia 5 years earlier, the California sun having etched lines around his eyes and mouth. Thomas, Abigail said softly, approaching the bed. His eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition. Abigail, thank God. He tried to sit up but winced in pain. Your train. I couldn't meet you. I'm so sorry. Lie still, Abigail soothed, taking his hand. I'm here now. That's all that matters. Thomas's gaze moved past her to where Jack stood just inside the doorway. Irwin, is that you? Jack stepped forward. Morning, Thomas. Found your cousin standing alone at the depot yesterday evening. Thought I'd better look after her until we could get to town. Gratitude washed over Thomas's features. Thank you, Jack. I've been half out of my mind worrying about her arriving with no one to meet her. He squeezed Abigail's hand. The cave-in happened so suddenly. 3 days ago, I was checking a new vein when the supports gave way. You need to rest, Abigail said firmly. We can talk about all that later. A gray-haired man in a black suit entered the room, a stethoscope hanging around his neck. Ah, you must be the cousin, he said, extending his hand to Abigail. Jonathan Miller. Your cousin is lucky to be alive, young lady. That mine took 2 men and nearly claimed a third. When can he leave? Abigail asked, noting the pallor of Thomas's skin. Dr. Miller stroked his beard thoughtfully. The leg needs at least 6 weeks to heal properly. The concussion is my greater concern at present. He needs quiet and care for at least another week here before I'd consider moving him. Abigail's heart sank. She had expected to move into Thomas's home immediately to begin her new life in California. What about his house? She asked. I could prepare it for his return. Thomas shook his head weakly. I don't have a proper house, Abigail. I've been living in a cabin at the mine site. It's no place for you, especially not alone. His eyes clouded with worry. I should have written, explained better. The teaching position doesn't start until the new schoolhouse is finished next month. I thought we'd have time to find you suitable accommodations. Abigail felt her carefully laid plans crumbling. She had exactly $23 left in her reticule, not enough to secure lodging for 6 weeks until Thomas recovered. Jack, who had been silent during this exchange, cleared his throat. Thomas, if you're agreeable, Miss Zimmerman could stay at my ranch until you're on your feet again. The spare room's comfortable enough, and it would give her time to get acquainted with San Andreas properly. Thomas looked from Jack to Abigail, clearly torn between proper concerns for his cousin's reputation and the practical reality of their situation. It's highly irregular, he said slowly, but I know you to be an honorable man, Irwin. He turned to Abigail. Jack's place is just outside of town, respectable and safe. But people talk in small towns. Your reputation can be preserved if we're sensible about it, Jack interjected. Miss Zimmerman could come into town daily, perhaps assist at the school preparations. People would understand the circumstances. Dr. Miller, who had been listening with interest, nodded. I could mention to my wife that Miss Zimmerman is staying at the Irwin Ranch temporarily while her cousin recovers. Martha is the head of the Ladies' Aid Society. Her approval would silence most wagging tongues. Abigail looked from the doctor to Thomas to Jack, aware that her future was being decided by men she barely knew, yet seeing no better alternative. I would be grateful for Mr. Irwin's hospitality until you recover, Thomas, she said finally. And I would welcome the opportunity to help with the school preparations. Thomas seemed to relax slightly. If you're certain, Abigail, Jack's a good man. Saved my life once when my mule threw me on the trail to the North Star. Jack looked uncomfortable with the praise. Any man would have done the same. Not any man rides 5 miles in a thunderstorm to fetch a doctor, Thomas countered. He turned back to Abigail. I trust him with my life. I can trust him with your safety. The matter decided, they spent another hour with Thomas, Abigail recounting news from the family back east while Jack spoke with Dr. Miller about Thomas's prognosis. When Thomas's eyelids began to droop, Mrs. Hollis shooed them from the room, insisting her patient needed rest. You can visit again tomorrow, she told Abigail as she showed them out. Morning is best when he has more strength. Outside, Jack suggested they visit the general store to purchase any supplies Abigail might need during her stay. The store was a large wooden building on the main street, its windows displaying an array of goods from practical tools to colorful fabrics. "Mr. Irwin." The shopkeeper greeted them as they entered. Twice in 1 week must be some kind of record. His curious gaze settled on Abigail. "Morning, Mr. Henderson," Jack replied, his tone friendly but reserved. "This is Miss Abigail Zimmerman, Thomas Zimmerman's cousin from Philadelphia." "Miss Zimmerman, this is Edward Henderson, owner of the finest establishment in San Andreas." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Zimmerman," Henderson said, his expression softening. "Heard about Thomas's accident. Terrible business. He's a good customer and a better man." "Thank you," Abigail replied. "The doctor says he's expected to make a full recovery with time." As Jack helped Abigail select necessities: soap, hairpins, writing paper, and a few other items, she became aware of the interested glances from other customers. Word of her arrival had clearly begun to spread. A well-dressed woman approached as Abigail was examining a bolt of calico, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Abigail's appearance. "You must be Thomas Zimmerman's cousin," she said without preamble. "I'm Agnes Thornton, head of the school board. Thomas mentioned you were coming to teach at our new school." "Yes, madam," Abigail replied, extending her hand. "Abigail Zimmerman. I taught at the girls' seminary in Philadelphia for the past 3 years. Mrs. Thornton's assessment seemed to find Abigail acceptable. The schoolhouse should be completed within the month. In the meantime, perhaps you'd care to review our curriculum plans. We meet on Wednesday afternoons at the church." "I'd be delighted," Abigail said, grateful for the opportunity to establish herself professionally in the community. "Excellent. And where are you staying while Thomas recovers? The hotel is hardly suitable for a young woman alone." Before Abigail could respond, a familiar deep voice spoke from behind her. "Miss Zimmerman is staying at my ranch, Mrs. Thornton," Jack said, his tone respectful but firm. Given the circumstances, it seemed the most practical solution until her cousin is back on his feet. Mrs. Thornton's eyebrows rose fractionally, but to Abigail's relief, she nodded. "Very sensible, Mr. Irwin. We can hardly expect the poor girl to fend for herself when her only family in California is laid up." She turned back to Abigail. "You must join us for Sunday services. The congregation would love to meet our new teacher." By the time they left the store, Abigail had been introduced to half a dozen townspeople, all of whom seemed genuinely welcoming despite their obvious curiosity. As Jack helped her mount Daisy for the ride back to the ranch, she felt a curious mix of relief and trepidation about her situation. "Everyone seems very friendly," she remarked as they rode out of town. Jack chuckled. "Small towns are always interested in newcomers, especially pretty young women from back east. You'll be the talk of San Andreas for a week or two, then they'll find something else to gossip about." Abigail felt her cheeks warm at his casual reference to her appearance. "I hope I haven't caused you any difficulty by accepting your offer of lodging." Jack's expression grew serious. "My reputation can withstand a bit of talk. Yours is the one we need to protect." He glanced at her. "Mrs. Thornton's approval helps. She's a formidable ally." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the golden hills. Abigail found herself studying Jack's profile against the landscape, the strong line of his jaw, the way he sat easily in the saddle as if born to it. There was a quiet confidence about him that she found both intriguing and comforting. Back at the ranch, Jack showed Abigail around the property properly in the daylight: the barn with its neat stalls and hayloft, the corral where several horses grazed, the small garden behind the cabin where vegetables grew in tidy rows. "The creek never runs dry, even in summer," he explained, leading her along a path to where the water bubbled over rocks. And the spring house keeps milk and butter cool. He pointed to a small stone structure built partially into the hillside. It's lovely, Abigail said honestly, taking in the peaceful setting with the mountains rising in the distance. You've built something wonderful here. Jack looked pleased by her words. It's getting there. Still have plans for expansion, another bedroom, a proper kitchen, maybe a porch swing. He stopped, as if realizing he was revealing too much of his dreams. But it serves well enough for now. That evening, after a simple dinner of beans, cornbread, and fresh tomatoes from the garden, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and pink. Jack had brought out the rocking chair for Abigail, taking a wooden stool for himself. "May I ask you something, Jack?" Abigail said as the first stars began to appear. "Of course." "Why did you stop at the depot yesterday? You said you saw the train pulling out." Jack was quiet for a moment, rolling a quirly cigarette between his fingers without lighting it. "Truth is, I was in town picking up supplies when I heard folks talking about Thomas's accident. Remembered him mentioning his cousin was coming from Philadelphia. When I saw the train pull away, I thought I'd check if you'd arrived. So it wasn't coincidence," Abigail mused. "Not entirely," Jack admitted. "Though I didn't expect to find you standing there alone with your trunk looking so." He paused, searching for the right word. "Lost," Abigail suggested. "Determined," Jack corrected her. "You didn't look defeated, Miss Zimmerman. You looked like a woman figuring out what to do next." Abigail smiled, touched by his perception. "I was trying to decide if I could manage the trunk on my own to the hotel. And now here you are on a ranch outside San Andreas with a man you met yesterday." Jack shook his head slightly. "Life takes unexpected turns." "Indeed it does," Abigail agreed softly. As darkness fell completely, Jack lit a lamp in the cabin, its warm glow spilling out onto the porch. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its lonesome cry echoing across the hills. "We should head in," Jack said, standing. "Morning comes early on a ranch." That night, lying in the narrow bed with the unfamiliar sounds of the California wilderness around her, Abigail reflected on the strange path that had led her here. Her parents' deaths, the desperate letter to her cousin, the long journey west, and now this unexpected arrangement with a cowboy she barely knew. Yet for the first time in months, she felt a sense of possibility rather than loss. Whatever happened next, she had survived the hardest day. She would find her way. The following weeks fell into a pattern that gradually began to feel like a new kind of normal for Abigail. Morning started early at the Irwin ranch, with Jack rising before dawn to tend to the livestock while Abigail prepared breakfast. They would ride into San Andreas 3 times a week, Abigail to visit Thomas at Dr. Miller's, and attend meetings about the new school, Jack to conduct business or purchase supplies. Thomas improved steadily under Dr. Miller's care. The head wound healed quickly, but his broken leg would keep him immobile for weeks yet. He worried about imposing on Jack's hospitality, but Abigail assured him that the arrangement was working well. "Jack's been a perfect gentleman," she told Thomas during one visit in early October. "And I've made myself useful around the ranch." It was true. Abigail had taken over the cooking and mending, tasks Jack had clearly been managing with bachelor efficiency rather than skill. She had planted late-season greens in the garden and pickled the last of the summer vegetables for winter storage. The cabin had never been cleaner, and Jack's shirts had never been so well pressed. For his part, Jack seemed genuinely appreciative of her contributions, often expressing surprise at the improvements she made to the simple meals he was accustomed to preparing. "Never thought beans could taste this good," he remarked one evening, helping himself to a second serving of the stew Abigail had prepared with herbs from the small garden. Their evenings had developed a comfortable rhythm. After dinner, they would often sit by the fire, Jack reading from one of his surprisingly numerous books while Abigail worked on mending or wrote letters to her remaining family back east. Sometimes they talked, Jack describing his travels across the West before settling in California, Abigail sharing stories of her teaching experiences in Philadelphia. Abigail found herself increasingly drawn to this quiet man who moved through life with such unassuming competence. He rarely spoke of his accomplishments, but she gathered pieces of his story from comments made by townspeople during their visits to San Andreas. Jack Irwin's the one who organized the bucket brigade when the assay office caught fire last year, Mrs. Henderson told her at the general store. Saved half the town from burning down. Finest horseman in the county, the blacksmith declared when Jack was having Daisy's shoe replaced. Broke that Mustang stallion no one else could get near. He brings venison to the widows every winter, Mrs. Thornton confided after a school board meeting. Never makes a fuss about it, just leaves it on their doorsteps. Each revelation added to the portrait of a man who lived by a quiet code of honor and service to his community. Yet Jack himself seemed uncomfortable with praise, always deflecting attention from his good deeds. October brought cooler temperatures and occasional rain that turned the Golden Hills to a soft green. The school building neared completion, and Abigail spent more time in town preparing for classes to begin in November. She had been formally introduced to the congregation at the white-steepled church, where her Eastern education and gentle manners had made a favorable impression. If there was gossip about her living arrangement with Jack, it remained respectful, tempered by the community's understanding of her situation and Jack's established reputation. Still, Abigail was aware of the curious glances and occasional knowing smiles when she and Jack rode into town together. One rainy afternoon in late October, Abigail was alone at the ranch, Jack having ridden out to check on a distant part of his property where he kept several head of cattle. The steady drumming of rain on the cabin roof created a cozy atmosphere as she sat near the fire, reviewing the curriculum materials Mrs. Thornton had provided. A knock at the door startled her. Visitors were rare, especially in inclement weather. Setting aside her papers, Abigail rose and crossed to the door, opening it to find a rain-soaked young man standing on the porch. "Miguel," she exclaimed, recognizing Jack's former ranch hand from his description. "Come in out of the rain." The young Mexican man removed his hat, water streaming from its brim. "Gracias, señorita. Is Señor Jack here? He's checking the north pasture," Abigail explained, gesturing toward the fire. "Come warm yourself. He should return soon." Miguel stepped inside cautiously, clearly surprised to find a woman in Jack's cabin. "You are Señor Jack's wife?" he asked hesitantly. "No," Abigail said quickly, feeling her cheeks warm. "I'm a friend. My cousin was injured, and Mr. Irwin kindly offered his spare room until other arrangements could be made." Miguel nodded, though his expression suggested he found the explanation curious. He accepted the cup of coffee Abigail offered and stood near the fire, steam rising from his damp clothes. "I've come back to work," he explained. "My mother is better now, and my family needs the money." "Jack will be pleased," Abigail said. "He's mentioned several times how much he misses your help." They fell into an awkward silence, Miguel clearly uncertain how to converse with this unexpected female presence in his former employer's home. The sound of hoofbeats outside announced Jack's return. He burst through the door, rain dripping from his slicker, then stopped short at the sight of Miguel standing by the fire. "Miguel, when did you get back?" "Today, Señor Jack," Miguel replied, a grin spreading across his young face. "I can work again if you still need me, need you." "Of course I need you," Jack said, clapping the younger man on the shoulder. "The north fence is half collapsed, the barn roof leaks, and those steers in the upper pasture are getting fat and lazy with no one to move them regularly." Miguel's smile widened. "I can start tomorrow." "You can start by getting dry and having some of Miss Zimmerman's stew," Jack countered, hanging his slicker on a peg by the door. "Then you can tell me how your mother is doing." The easy camaraderie between the two men warmed Abigail's heart. She served the stew while Miguel updated Jack on his family's situation and the journey back from Mexico. As they talked, she noticed how Jack treated the younger man with respect rather than as a servant, asking his opinions and listening attentively to his suggestions about the ranch. After Miguel had gone to settle into the bunkhouse attached to the barn, Jack helped Abigail clear the dishes. "Having Miguel back will be a big help," he said, drying a plate with more concentration than the task required. "Yes, I'm sure it will," Abigail agreed, scrubbing a pot with perhaps unnecessary vigor. A strange tension had fallen between them, something Abigail couldn't quite name. Jack seemed unusually quiet, his customary ease in her presence replaced by a formality that hadn't existed for weeks. "Is something troubling you?" she finally asked, setting the pot aside. Jack ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. "Just thinking that with Thomas improving and the school nearly ready, you'll be moving to town soon." Abigail's hands stilled in the wash basin. The thought had occurred to her as well, but she had pushed it aside, unwilling to examine too closely the reluctance she felt at the prospect of leaving the ranch. "Yes, I suppose I will," she said carefully. "Doctor Miller thinks Thomas might be ready to move to a boarding house in town within the next 2 weeks. Jack nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's for the best. A lady like you belongs in town, not out here on a ranch with just a cowboy and his Mexican hand for company." His words stung, though Abigail knew he meant no offense. "I've been quite comfortable here," she said, trying to keep her tone light. "I'll miss your library. The selection at the general store is rather limited." A small smile touched Jack's lips. "You're welcome to borrow books anytime." The rain continued to drum on the roof as they finished the dishes in silence, each lost in thoughts neither seemed willing to share. The following Sunday, Abigail sat beside Jack in the white church in San Andreas, listening to Reverend Wilson's sermon on Ruth's faithfulness. Thomas, still on crutches but well enough to leave Dr. Miller's care, sat on her other side, his injured leg extended awkwardly into the aisle. Abigail found her attention wandering from the sermon to the man beside her. Jack sat straight in the hard pew, his Sunday clothes neat but simple, a clean white shirt, dark vest, and his best jeans. His hat rested on his knee, his dark hair still showing the impression of its brim. His hands, strong and capable, held the hymnal with care, turning the pages gently as if the book were something precious. In the 2 months since he had found her at the train depot, Jack Irwin had become important to her in ways Abigail had not anticipated. His quiet strength, his unfailing kindness, his dry humor that emerged when he was most at ease, all these had woven themselves into the fabric of her daily life. The prospect of moving to town, of no longer sharing meals and evening conversations by the fire, left an emptiness in her chest that she could not ignore. After the service, they joined the congregation outside in the crisp autumn sunshine. Mrs. Thornton approached, her usual commanding presence somewhat softened by a genuine smile. "Miss Zimmerman, the school board has prepared the teachers' quarters for you," she announced. "It's the small house adjacent to the schoolhouse, modest but quite comfortable for a single lady. You can move in as soon as you wish." "Thank you, Mrs. Thornton," Abigail replied, aware of Jack stiffening almost imperceptibly beside her. "That's very kind of the board." "Not at all. We're fortunate to have secured a teacher of your caliber." Mrs. Thornton's gaze shifted to Jack. "Mr. Irwin, the community appreciates your generosity in housing Miss Zimmerman during this difficult time. It speaks well of your character." Jack touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Just being neighborly, madam." Thomas, balancing on his crutches, joined the conversation. "Indeed, we're all grateful to Jack. I'll be moving into Mrs. Peterson's boarding house tomorrow, now that the doctor's given his approval. Perhaps you'd like to move to the teacher's quarters at the same time, Abigail." All eyes turned to her, waiting for her response. Abigail felt a momentary panic at the suddenness of the decision being forced upon her. That is, I've promised to help Jack with the apple harvest this week," she improvised, not entirely untruthfully. The small orchard behind the cabin did indeed need harvesting. "Perhaps at the end of the week," Mrs. Thornton nodded approvingly. "Very conscientious of you to honor your commitments, Miss Zimmerman. The house will be ready whenever you are." As the group dispersed, Thomas gave Abigail a curious look. "Apple harvest? Since when are you so concerned with fruit picking?" "Since Jack has been kind enough to give me a home these past 2 months," Abigail replied with more sharpness than she intended. "The least I can do is help with the chores before I leave." Thomas studied her face for a moment, then glanced at Jack, who was speaking with the blacksmith a few yards away. A knowing expression crossed Thomas's features. "I see," he said quietly. "Well, there's no rush. The school doesn't open for another 2 weeks." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each of them preoccupied with their own thoughts. Jack helped Abigail from her horse with the same careful courtesy he always showed, his hands strong and sure at her waist, but he released her immediately once her feet touched the ground, as if afraid to linger. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jack finally broke the silence that had stretched between them all day. "You don't have to stay for the apple harvest," he said, his voice low. "Miguel can help with that. You should get settled in town before school starts." Abigail turned to look at him, his profile outlined against the darkening sky. "Are you eager to be rid of me, Jack Irwin?" The question came out more plaintively than she had intended, and she immediately regretted her directness. Jack's head snapped toward her, surprise evident in his expression. "No," he said simply. "That's not it at all." "Then what is it?" Abigail pressed, surprising herself with her boldness. "You've barely spoken to me since Miguel returned, and now you're practically pushing me out the door." Jack stood abruptly, pacing the length of the porch before turning to face her. "You don't belong here, Abigail. You're educated, refined. You should be in town, where there are proper houses with parlors and pianos, where ladies call on each other for tea." He gestured at the simple ranch around them. "Not out here with the cattle and the dust and a man who didn't even finish school." Abigail rose from the rocking chair, her heart pounding. "Shouldn't I be the one to decide where I belong?" Jack stared at her, his blue eyes intense in the fading light. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Abigail began, then faltered, suddenly unsure of herself. What was she saying? That she had feelings for this man, that the thought of leaving the ranch filled her with dread. That somewhere in these weeks of shared meals and conversations and quiet evenings, she had begun to think of this place as home. "I'm saying that I've been happy here," she finished simply. Jack took a step toward her, hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. "Abigail," the moment was shattered by the sound of a rider approaching at speed. They both turned to see a man galloping toward the ranch, his horse lathered with exertion. "Irwin," the man called as he neared. "Fire at the Henderson place. The whole town's turning out." Jack was instantly in motion, calling to Miguel, who emerged from the bunkhouse at the commotion. "Saddle the horses. Bring burlap sacks, blankets, anything we can use to beat back flames." Within minutes, Jack and Miguel were mounted, prepared to ride toward the glow now visible on the horizon. Jack paused, looking down at Abigail from his saddle. "Stay here," he said urgently. "I'll return when I can." And then he was gone, leaving Abigail standing alone on the porch, their unfinished conversation hanging in the air between them. The fire at the Henderson farm, caused by a lantern knocked over in the barn, burned for hours. From the porch of the ranch, Abigail could see the orange glow against the night sky, flaring and receding as the townspeople fought to contain the blaze. She paced anxiously, unable to sleep, wondering if Jack was safe. It was nearly dawn when he returned, his clothes and face blackened with soot, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. Miguel followed, looking equally spent. "The Hendersons?" Abigail asked as Jack dismounted slowly, his movements stiff. "Lost the barn and most of the livestock," he replied wearily. "But the house is safe, and no one was hurt. That's what matters." She led him inside where she had kept water heating on the stove and food ready. Jack sank into a chair at the table, too tired to even remove his ruined shirt. Abigail poured water into a basin and, without asking permission, began to gently wash the soot from his face and hands. "You need to rest," she said softly, noticing the burns on his palms where he had clearly handled hot debris. "Just need a moment," Jack murmured, his eyes closing briefly as she tended to him. "Then I should check on the cattle." "Miguel is seeing to the animals," Abigail informed him, applying salve to his burned hands. "Your only responsibility right now is to let me take care of you." Too exhausted to argue, Jack allowed her to help him to his bedroom, a room Abigail had never entered before. It was as simple as the rest of the cabin, with a larger bed than her own, a chest of drawers, and a small table holding a lamp and several books. She helped him remove his boots but drew the line at further assistance, leaving him to change into clean clothes while she prepared a tray of food. When she returned with bread, cold meat, and coffee, Jack was sitting on the edge of his bed in a clean shirt, his hair damp where he had clearly made an attempt to wash it. "You should be sleeping," she chided gently, setting the tray beside him. "Too hungry to sleep," he replied, reaching for the coffee with his bandaged hands. Abigail sat beside him, an intimacy she would never have dared under normal circumstances. "Let me," she said, holding the cup to his lips. Jack's eyes met hers over the rim of the cup, something unreadable in their depths. When he had drunk his fill, Abigail set the cup aside and began to cut the bread and meat into manageable pieces. "I can feed myself," Jack protested weakly. "Of course you can," Abigail agreed. "But why should you have to?" As she tended to him, the barriers that had existed between them, proprieties, social conventions, their own uncertainties seemed to dissolve in the face of more immediate needs. When Jack had eaten his fill, Abigail took the tray and rose to leave. "Abigail," Jack said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Thank you." She smiled down at him. "Rest now. We can talk when you wake." Jack nodded, already lying back on the bed, his eyes drifting closed. Abigail pulled a quilt over him before quietly leaving the room, closing the door behind her. Jack slept through the day and into the evening, his body demanding the rest his stubborn nature would normally have denied it. Abigail busied herself with chores, helped Miguel with the necessary ranch work, and prepared a hearty stew for when Jack awoke. It was dark when she heard his bedroom door open. Jack emerged, looking rumpled but rested, the soot washed from his face and hair, though shadows of fatigue still lingered beneath his eyes. "You should have woken me," he said, taking a seat at the table where Abigail was mending one of his shirts. "You needed the rest," she replied simply, setting aside her sewing to serve him the stew she had kept warm on the stove. They ate in companionable silence, the events of the previous night creating a new ease between them. When the meal was finished, Jack helped clear the dishes despite Abigail's protests about his burned hands. "They're not so bad," he assured her, though she noticed he winced slightly when the hot water touched the raw skin. Later, they sat before the fire as they had on so many evenings, but something had changed. The uncertainty that had plagued them before the fire seemed to have burned away, leaving a clearer understanding in its wake. "I spoke with Thomas in town last night before the fire," Jack said eventually, his voice quiet in the stillness of the cabin. "Asked him something important." Abigail's heart quickened. "Oh," Jack turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Asked his permission to court you properly, if you were willing." The simple words hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Abigail felt her breath catch in her throat. "And what did my cousin say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A smile touched Jack's lips, softening the weary lines of his face. "He said he reckoned you were old enough to make up your own mind, but that if you were foolish enough to have me, he wouldn't stand in our way." Abigail laughed softly, relief and joy bubbling up within her. "That sounds like Thomas." Jack reached for her hand, his touch gentle despite his calloused fingers. "So I'm asking you, Abigail Zimmerman, would you allow me to court you? It won't be easy, a ranch wife's life is hard, and I can't offer you the comforts of town living. But I promise you this, you'll never find a man who will cherish you more." Abigail looked into his earnest blue eyes, thinking of that moment at the train depot when he had appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't even known to make. "Jack Irwin," she said, twining her fingers with his, "I believe I would like that very much." The relief and joy that transformed his face was answer enough, but Jack sealed his intentions by raising her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles with a reverence that brought tears to Abigail's eyes. "I should still move to the teacher's quarters," she said regretfully. "For propriety's sake, now more than ever." Jack nodded, though he didn't release her hand. "I know, but San Andreas isn't so far. I'll call on you, properly bring flowers, take you for drives on Sundays." A mischievous glint appeared in his eyes. "Show those town folk how a cowboy courts a lady." Abigail moved to the teacher's cottage the following weekend, the small two-room structure adjacent to the new schoolhouse becoming her first real home in California. The Ladies' Aid Society, led by Mrs. Thornton, had furnished it simply but comfortably with a narrow bed, a table and chairs, a small settee, and even a modest bookshelf. True to his word, Jack called on her regularly, arriving on Saturday evenings freshly shaven and wearing his best shirt, often with wildflowers or a book he thought she might enjoy. They attended church together on Sundays, took picnics in the foothills when weather permitted, and occasionally dined at the hotel restaurant for special occasions. The school opened in November, with 15 pupils ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. Abigail found teaching in California different from her experience in Philadelphia. The children were often more practical than academic, their education interrupted by seasonal work on farms and ranches. But she adapted her methods, incorporating lessons about agriculture and mining alongside reading, writing, and arithmetic. Thomas recovered fully by Christmas, taking up residence in a small cabin near the North Star mine, where he had been promoted to foreman following the accident. He watched the courtship between his cousin and Jack Irwin with amused approval, often joining them for Sunday dinners at the ranch. Winter in the foothills brought rain and occasional snow. The landscape transformed from gold to green as new grass emerged on the hills. Jack's ranch prospered with Miguel's return and the addition of 20 head of cattle purchased from a neighboring spread. The apple harvest had been bountiful, and Abigail's preserves lined the shelves of both the ranch kitchen and her own small pantry. On a clear February evening in 1877, 5 months after Abigail had arrived in San Andreas, Jack appeared at her cottage door with an unusual request. "Would you ride out to the ranch with me?" he asked, a mysterious smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "There's something I want to show you." Intrigued, Abigail agreed, donning her warmest shawl against the evening chill. They rode out as the sun began its descent, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. When they arrived at the ranch, Jack helped her dismount but kept hold of her hand. "Close your eyes," he instructed, his voice betraying his excitement. Bemused, Abigail complied, allowing him to lead her carefully up the steps of the porch and through the front door of the cabin. The familiar smells of wood smoke and pine greeted her, but there was something different in the air, a freshness she couldn't identify. "You can look now," Jack said, releasing her hand. Abigail opened her eyes to find the cabin transformed. The main room had been expanded, the wall that had separated her small bedroom now gone to create a more spacious living area. A new window let in the last of the evening light, and the furniture had been rearranged to accommodate the larger space. But the most striking addition was the small upright piano that stood against one wall, its dark wood gleaming in the firelight. "Jack," she breathed, stepping forward to touch the instrument reverently. "How did you?" "Henderson ordered it from Sacramento for his wife's birthday, but after the fire they couldn't keep it," Jack explained, watching her reaction closely. "I've been working on expanding the cabin all winter whenever you were in town. Miguel helped with the heavy lifting." Abigail's fingers skimmed the ivory keys, producing a soft chord. "It's beautiful. But why?" Jack stepped closer, taking both her hands in his. "Because I've been thinking about what you said about deciding where you belong." He looked around the cabin, pride evident in his expression. "I'm trying to make this a place where you might choose to belong. With me." Abigail felt tears welling in her eyes as understanding dawned. "Jack Irwin, are you asking what I think you're asking?" In answer, Jack reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. Dropping to one knee before her, he opened it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl. "Abigail Zimmerman, from the moment I saw you standing alone at that train depot, something in my heart knew you were meant to be here." His voice was steady but filled with emotion. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. I'm asking you to stay with me not just for now but forever. Will you marry me?" Through her tears, Abigail saw the hope and love shining in his eyes, the same emotion that had been growing in her own heart since that fateful day in September. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Jack, I will marry you." Jack slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to pull her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a tender kiss that spoke of promises kept and dreams shared. "It won't always be easy," he murmured when they parted, his forehead resting against hers. Abigail smiled, thinking of all they had already weathered together: her unexpected arrival, Thomas's injury, the Henderson fire, the challenges of building their separate lives while their hearts grew ever more entwined. "The best things rarely are," she replied, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "But we'll face whatever comes together." They were married in the white church in San Andreas on a perfect May morning in 1877, the entire town turning out for the wedding of their schoolteacher to the rancher who had won her heart. Thomas gave the bride away, standing tall and strong, all traces of his injury gone save for a slight limp in damp weather. Mrs. Thornton organized a reception in the schoolyard, where tables groaned under the weight of dishes contributed by every family in the community. As they danced beneath lanterns strung from the oak trees, Jack held Abigail close, whispering in her ear, "Happy, Mrs. Irwin." "Completely," she replied, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had whispered, "Stay with me," when she needed those words most. Their life together unfolded with the seasons, the ranch expanding as Jack's hard work and careful management yielded results, the school flourishing under Abigail's gentle guidance. She continued teaching for 2 years after their marriage, until the birth of their first child, a son they named William Thomas, prompted her to focus on home and family. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, and another son, James, 2 years after that. The cabin grew along with their family, first another bedroom, then a proper kitchen, finally the wide porch with the swing Jack had once mentioned as a dream. On a warm September afternoon in 1886, Abigail sat on that swing, watching her children play in the yard while Jack mended a saddle on the steps beside her. 10 years had passed since she had stood alone at the train depot, her future uncertain. "What are you thinking about?" Jack asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Abigail smiled, reaching out to touch his hair, now showing threads of silver at the temples. "I was thinking about trunks and train depots and how the best journeys sometimes begin when plans go awry." Jack set aside his work and moved to join her on the swing, his arms sliding comfortably around her shoulders. "Best decision I ever made, riding out to that depot that day." "Mine too," Abigail agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder as their children's laughter filled the air around them. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land that had become their home, a home built on courage, hard work, and the love that had bloomed between a stranded Eastern lady and the cowboy who had whispered, "Stay with me," when she needed to hear those words most of all. 15 years after that fateful day at the depot, the Irwin Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in Calaveras County. Jack's careful breeding of cattle and horses had paid dividends, while Abigail's orchard expanded from those original apple trees to include pears, plums, and cherries, supplied fruit to markets as far away as Sacramento. Their children grew strong and curious, each developing their own talents. William, now 14, had his father's way with horses and his mother's love of books. 12-year-old Elizabeth played the piano with a natural grace that brought tears to Abigail's eyes, while 10-year-old James showed an aptitude for numbers that suggested he might one day manage the ranch's expanding business affairs. The town of San Andreas had grown as well, the mining industry giving way to more sustainable commerce as the easy gold played out. A proper bank had replaced the assay office. A small hospital had been built with donations from grateful families. And the school where Abigail had once taught now employed 3 teachers to accommodate the growing population. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Jack surprised Abigail with a journey, not the arduous trek across the country she had made as a young woman, but a pleasant trip by train to San Francisco, where they stayed in a fine hotel overlooking the bay. "I never thanked you properly," Jack said as they stood on the hotel balcony, watching ships move across the water in the moonlight. "For what?" Abigail asked, her hand comfortably entwined with his. "For trusting me that day at the depot. For taking a chance on a dusty cowboy with more dreams than achievements." Abigail smiled, thinking of the life they had built together, the children they had raised, the land they had nurtured, the love that had deepened with each passing year. "I think we've both done quite well with that chance," she replied, leaning into the solid strength of his embrace. When they returned to San Andreas, They found that Miguel, now the ranch foreman with a wife and children of his own living in a house Jack had built on the property, had managed everything perfectly in their absence. The children, temporarily in Thomas's care, greeted them with excited stories of their adventures with their bachelor uncle. Life settled back into its pleasant rhythm, the seasonal work of the ranch, the children's education, the community gatherings that marked holidays and harvests. But something had shifted subtly during their time away. A recognition of all they had accomplished, and a renewed appreciation for the partnership that had made it possible. One evening, as they sat on their porch swing watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jack handed Abigail a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she asked, surprised by the unexpected gift. "Open it," Jack urged, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Inside the package was a leather-bound journal, its pages blank save for an inscription on the first page in Jack's careful handwriting. "For Abigail to record our story for those who come after us." Touched by his thoughtfulness, Abigail ran her fingers over the smooth leather. "Our story," Jack nodded, his blue eyes still as clear and honest as they had been on that first day meeting hers. "Started thinking in San Francisco about how much has happened since you stepped off that train. Thought maybe it was worth writing down." That night, after the children were asleep, Abigail sat at the small desk in their bedroom and opened the journal. Her pen hovered over the blank page for a moment before she began to write. "In September of 1876, I stood alone on the platform of the San Andreas depot, my single trunk beside me, watching as the train that had carried me across the country disappeared into the distance. I did not know then that being left alone at that depot would lead me to the greatest happiness of my life." As the years passed, the journal filled with the story of their life together, the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and challenges, the small daily moments that formed the tapestry of their shared existence. Abigail recorded William's first solo ride across the ranch at 16, Elizabeth's beautiful performance at the town's Christmas concert, James's acceptance to a business school in Sacramento. She wrote of the drought that tested their resilience, the bumper harvest that followed, the night Thomas finally married a widow from neighboring Angels Camp, bringing a stepson and stepdaughter into their extended family. She described the gradual changes in the landscape as more settlers arrived, the expansion of their ranch as neighboring properties were acquired, and the bittersweet day when they accompanied William to catch the train east for college, the same train that had brought Abigail to California 20 years earlier. In 1898, when Elizabeth married the son of San Andreas's doctor, the celebration was held on the Irwin Ranch, with tables set under the massive oak trees and lanterns glowing as dusk fell. Abigail, watching her daughter dance with her new husband, felt Jack's arm slip around her waist. "Remembering our wedding day?" he asked, his voice still carrying that hint of Georgia that had never completely disappeared. "Among other things," Abigail replied, leaning into his familiar embrace. At 44, she still found her heart quickening at his touch, though silver now threaded her honey-blonde hair and fine lines marked the passage of time around her eyes. Jack, his own dark hair liberally streaked with gray, his face weathered by years of sun and wind, remained as handsome to her as he had been that first evening. "Any regrets, Mrs. Irwin?" Abigail turned to face him fully, her hands resting on the chest that had been her shelter through 2 decades of joy and sorrow. "Not a single one, Mr. Irwin." That night, Abigail added another entry to the journal that now filled several volumes. "Today our Elizabeth became Mrs. David Miller, dancing beneath the same trees where her father and I once celebrated our own union." As I watched her radiant face, I was struck by how life moves in circles, endings becoming beginnings, journeys leading us back to places we never knew we were seeking. 22 years ago, I stood alone at a train depot, believing myself abandoned. Instead, I was being delivered precisely where I belonged. When Jack rode up and whispered, "Stay with me," he could not have known how completely I would take those words to heart. By the dawn of the new century, the Irwin Ranch had become one of the landmarks of Calaveras County, a testament to what determination and vision could accomplish. William returned from college to join his father in expanding their holdings, bringing new ideas about breeding and land management. James, after completing his business studies, established a successful partnership with the bank in San Andreas that helped finance the growing enterprise. In 1902, as Abigail and Jack celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary, they received an unexpected gift: the trunk that had accompanied Abigail on her journey west, retrieved from the attic of their home and refurbished by their children. "We thought you might like to have it in the parlor," Elizabeth explained as her brothers carried the restored trunk into the main room of the house that had grown from Jack's original cabin. As a reminder of how it all began, Abigail ran her hand over the smooth wood, remembering how impossible it had seemed to move it alone that September evening so many years ago. "It seems smaller now," she mused. "Everything looks smaller with time and distance," Jack said, his hand finding hers as they stood surrounded by their family children, daughter-in-law, son-in-law, and now grandchildren who carried their features and mannerisms into a new generation. That evening, after the celebration had ended and their guests had departed, Jack and Abigail sat alone on the porch swing that had witnessed so many conversations, so many quiet moments of connection over the years. 25 years, Jack said softly, his thumb tracing circles on the back of Abigail's hand. "Seems like yesterday and forever all at once." Abigail nodded, thinking of all they had weathered together: drought and plenty, sickness and health, the inevitable losses and sorrows that come with a life fully lived. Through it all, their love had remained the cornerstone upon which everything else was built. "Do you remember what you told me that first night?" she asked. "When I worried about imposing on your hospitality," Jack smiled, the moonlight silvering his hair. "Said it was no imposition, that Thomas had helped me once and I was just returning the favor." "And was it?" "Just a favor to my cousin?" Abigail asked, though she knew the answer. Jack's eyes, still as blue and direct as they had been that first night, met hers. "Maybe at first, but when I saw you standing there on that platform, something inside me knew. Took a while to admit it to myself, but part of me recognized you before I even knew your name." Abigail laid her head on his shoulder, listening to the familiar rhythm of his heart beneath her ear. "I'm glad you stopped that day. Glad you whispered, 'Stay with me.'" "Best words I ever spoke," Jack replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And I'm even more glad that you listened." As they rocked gently in the dark, the stars wheeling overhead in the vast California sky, Abigail thought about the strange paths that lead us home, how a trunk too heavy to move, a missed connection, a moment of vulnerability can open the door to a lifetime of love. She thought of the young woman she had been, standing alone and afraid at the San Andreas depot, and wished she could tell that girl not to fear the unknown future. In her journal that night, Abigail wrote words meant not just for her children and grandchildren, but for anyone who might one day read their story. Life's greatest blessings often arrive disguised as misfortunes. A missed train, a heavy trunk, an unexpected detour, these may be the very things that lead us where we were always meant to be. 25 years ago, A cowboy rode up to a depot where I stood alone and whispered 3 words that changed my life. Stay with me. In choosing to trust those words, I found not just shelter for a night, but a home for a lifetime. Love, I have learned, is both the journey and the destination, and the companion you choose to travel beside makes all the difference. The years continued their steady march, bringing changes both expected and surprising. The 20th century transformed the world around them. Automobiles began to appear on San Andreas' streets. Telephones connected the once isolated communities of the foothills, and electric lights gradually replaced the oil lamps that had illuminated their early years together. Jack and Abigail adapted to these changes, as they had to all others, with curiosity, pragmatism, and a shared conviction that the foundation of their life together remained solid regardless of the shifting world around them. By 1916, as Europe was engulfed in the Great War, Jack and Abigail had settled into the gentle rhythms of their later years. At 68, Jack had handed over most of the ranch operations to William and James, though he still rode out most days to check the pastures or inspect the orchards Abigail had lovingly developed. Abigail, at 62, devoted her energies to her grandchildren, the garden that had expanded over the decades, and her ongoing chronicle of their life together. Their 40th wedding anniversary was celebrated with a gathering that included not only their children and grandchildren, but also many of the townspeople who had watched their story unfold over the decades. Thomas, now in his 70s but still spry, raised a toast to the couple whose love had become legendary in San Andreas. "To my cousin, Abigail, who came west with nothing but a trunk and hope," he said, his voice still strong despite his years. "And to Jack Irwin, who had the good sense to stop at the depot that day. You two have shown us all what it means to build a life together, not just a home or a ranch, but a legacy of love that will outlast us all." The following spring, as the apple trees Abigail had planted in those first years burst into bloom, Jack fell ill with pneumonia. For 2 weeks, Abigail rarely left his bedside, her hands cool on his fevered brow, her voice steady as she read to him from the journals that chronicled their years together. On a perfect May morning, with sunlight streaming through the bedroom windows and the scent of apple blossoms carried on the breeze, Jack opened his eyes, his fever broken at last. "Thought I heard you calling me home," he said weakly, his hand seeking Abigail's. "I was," she replied, tears of relief tracking down her cheeks. "I'll always call you home, Jack Irwin." His recovery was slow but steady, and by summer he was back on his feet, though with a new frailty that reminded them both of the passing years. They took to sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the western sky, their hands linked as they had been through 4 decades of companionship. "Never thought I'd have this," Jack confessed one evening as the first stars appeared above the darkening hills. "A home, a family, a woman who'd share it all with me for a lifetime." Abigail squeezed his hand, thinking of the lonely young man who had found her at the train depot, of the life they had built from that chance meeting. "And I never thought I'd find myself at the end of the world, falling in love with a cowboy," she teased gently. Jack chuckled, the sound as dear to her as it had been when she first heard it. California hardly seemed the end of the world to those of us who were already here. "It might as well have been, for a city girl from Philadelphia," Abigail replied, "but it became home because you were here." In the autumn of 1926, as they celebrated their golden wedding anniversary, Jack and Abigail stood together in the church where they had exchanged vows 50 years earlier. Around them gathered 4 generations of family, their children and their spouses. grandchildren ranging from William's oldest at 28 to James's youngest at 5, and even 2 great-grandchildren, babes in arms who represented the continuation of the legacy they had begun. The San Andreas that welcomed them for this celebration barely resembled the frontier town where Abigail had arrived in 1876. Paved roads had replaced the dusty tracks, automobiles outnumbered horses, and electric lights illuminated the streets where once oil lamps had cast their uncertain glow. Yet as Jack and Abigail renewed their vows before Reverend Wilson's successor, the essence of their commitment remained unchanged, a promise made and kept through half a century of changes, challenges, joys, and sorrows. "I have loved you for 50 years, Jack said, his voice still carrying that hint of Georgia that had first caught Abigail's attention. "And I will love you for 50 more if the good Lord grants them to us." "From the moment you whispered 'stay with me,' my heart was yours," Abigail replied, her hand steady in his despite the years that had marked them both with silver hair and lined faces. "It has been the privilege of my life to walk beside you." That evening, as the celebration continued around them, Jack led Abigail away from the festivities to the edge of the town where the old train depot still stood, now used primarily for freight, as passenger service had declined with the advent of automobiles. "Why are we here?" Abigail asked, though she suspected the answer. Jack's eyes, still that same clear blue though now set in a face weathered by 78 years of life, held hers with the same direct gaze that had given her courage so long ago. "Wanted to stand once more where it all began," he said simply. "Where I found you waiting, where our story started." Abigail looked at the weathered platform, trying to see it through the eyes of the young woman she had been frightened, alone, uncertain of her future. "I was so afraid that day," she admitted. "Afraid I'd made a terrible mistake coming west, afraid I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to." Jack nodded, understanding in his expression. "And I was afraid, too afraid you'd say no when I asked you to trust a stranger, afraid I wasn't good enough to help you." "We've come a long way from that day," Abigail said, squeezing his hand. "The best journey of my life," Jack agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "And it all started right here with 3 words I hadn't planned to say until I saw you standing alone with that trunk." As the sun set behind the Sierra Nevada mountains, painting the sky in the same golden hues they had witnessed together for 5 decades, Jack turned to Abigail and whispered the words that had changed both their lives. "Stay with me." And as she had 50 years before, Abigail Zimmerman Irwin looked into the eyes of the man she loved and made her choice not from desperation or necessity this time, but from the deepest certainty of her heart. "Always," she whispered back. "Always." They returned to the ranch that night, to the home they had built together from a simple cabin and a dream, to the life they had woven from courage, hard work, and unwavering love. The trunk that had once contained all of Abigail's worldly possessions now held the journals chronicling their shared journey, a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone, telling future generations the story of a lonely train depot, a chance meeting, and the 3 words that had begun a lifetime of happiness. And in the years that followed, as they moved gently into the final chapter of their lives together, Jack and Abigail Irwin remained as they had begun, side by side, hand in hand, their hearts beating in rhythm, their souls entwined in a love that had transformed them both, a love that had turned strangers into family, a house into a home, and 2 separate journeys into one shared path that neither would have traveled alone. When Jack passed peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1932, Abigail felt as though half her heart had gone with him. Yet in the midst of her grief, she found solace in the life they had built together, in the family that surrounded her with love, and in the memories that filled every corner of the home they had shared. On the first anniversary of his passing, Abigail sat on their porch swing as the sun set behind the mountains they had both come to love. Opening the final volume of her journal, she wrote the conclusion to their story. 55 years ago, I stood alone at the San Andreas depot with nothing but a trunk and shattered plans. When Jack Irwin rode up and whispered, "Stay with me," neither of us could have imagined the life we would build together, the love that would grow between us, the family that would spring from our union, the legacy we would leave in this land we both came to call home. I have been asked many times over the years what made me trust a stranger that day, what gave me the courage to accept his offer when all my upbringing cautioned against it. The answer has always been simple, though I did not recognize it then. In his eyes, I saw home. Not the home I had lost in Philadelphia, but the home I had yet to find, the place where my heart would take root and flourish. Our life together was not without hardship or sorrow, but it was rich beyond measure in the things that truly matter: love freely given and gratefully received, work that brought purpose and satisfaction, family bonds that strengthened with each passing year, and a partnership that made each of us better together than we could ever have been apart. Jack has gone ahead of me now, but I do not feel abandoned as I once did at that train depot. Instead, I feel his presence in every corner of the home we built, in the orchard whose blossoms scent the spring air, in the faces of our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who carry his spirit forward. And when my time comes to join him, I will go gladly, knowing that somewhere beyond this life, he waits for me as he once waited at the depot, ready to whisper once more, "Stay with me," and to lead me into whatever adventure awaits us next. Until then, I remain here, tending the life we planted together, grateful beyond words for that moment of fate or providence that brought a lonely Eastern lady and a California cowboy to the same place at the same time, changing both our lives forever. Left alone at the depot with a trunk, I found not abandonment but destiny. The cowboy rode up and whispered, "Stay with me," and in choosing to trust those words, I found my way home. Abigail closed the journal, her heart full of the love that had sustained her for more than half a century. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, she felt Jack's presence beside her on the swing, as real and comforting as it had been throughout their years together. And in the gentle evening breeze, she could almost hear his voice, whispering the words that had begun their journey, "Stay with me." With a smile, Abigail whispered back to the stars, to the mountains, to the memory that would never fade, "Always, my love, always."